I remember being delightfully surprised by Wonder Woman. I went to a Friday matinee of this film, and that may be the ideal way to watch this movie. I remember being in a crowd of like 8 people, and overall I enjoyed Wonder Woman. Sure, it was basically a reskin of the first Captain America film from the MCU, and the climax leaves a lot to be desired, but I recall being fairly positive on the film after my first viewing. You can check out our drunk view that came out in 2017 when this movie arrived.
Tell us about the plot of Wonder Woman in that case. Okay. It's a great movie.
This is also the first one we drunk viewed, as I said, which is our first reaction movie chat we do after most movies we see in theaters. Perhaps I'm full of shit and had a different reaction, but this is how I remember it, so that's how I'm going to write my story. Production was rocky on Wonder Woman to start, initially beginning production in 1996, a very early form, with Ivan Reitman, the director of Ghostbusters, attached. However, production stalled, as did most of the late 90s, early 2000s DC films in the wake of Batman and Robin. This couldn't have been helped by the fact that production started before the string of early 2000s superhero films that saved the genre, such as Blade, X-Men, and the Batman trilogy from Christopher Nolan. At one point, Sandra Bullock was being eyeballed to star, which I mean, Sandra Bullock's an okay actress, but Wonder Woman I don't really see. Granted, it's better than when they were floating around the idea of Mariah Carey. Almost 10 years into the on and off production, Joss Whedon was approached and wrote a script, with actresses considered being Kate Beckinsale and Angelina Jolie. Joss Whedon left the production shortly after. It switched hands some more before they tried to introduce Wonder Woman in George Miller's ill-fated attempt at Justice League. Paul Feig put his hat in the ring to make Wonder Woman an action comedy film. However, he couldn't get that off the ground either. It does amuse me that the director of Ghostbusters kind of launched the project, and the director of the Ghostbusters remake also tried to take a crack at Wonder Woman. Anyhow, eventually Patty Jenkins was brought on. It's worth noting she didn't end up writing the first Wonder Woman, with that honor going to Zack Snyder, Alan Heinberg, and Jason Foss, none of whom would return for the sequel. They decided to set Wonder Woman in World War I, which I think was smart, especially since it adds a slight difference from the similar Captain America the First Avenger movie, which took place during World War II. The origin for the film combines aspects of several comics, most notably the relatively recent, at the time, New 52, as well as George Perez's run. The film ran into a bit of controversy with a string of women-only screenings, which seems like such a non-issue, but it was seen by some critics as discrimination. However, it wasn't like only women could see the film, it was more of a fun thing theaters did. Most notably the Alamo Drafthouse, which is a fairly big theater chain here in the United States, primarily targeted at women. I don't really see a big deal in it, especially since it didn't count against race or anything like that, but whatever. The movie has a women-empowering theme, so I don't see why this was an issue, but man-babies who didn't want to go to the other showtimes were pissed that they couldn't go to these specific showtimes either. It also had some controversy with some Arab countries banning the film. The most relevant, probably, is the consideration to ban it in Palestine, as Gal Gadot was a soldier as part of the IDF, the Israeli army, and made comments opposing Palestine during the 2014 Israel-Palestine conflict. The story of Wonder Woman follows Diana Prince, or Wonder Woman, who's an Amazonian warrior trained by her aunt to eventually fight Ares, who the Amazonians know will someday come after Wonder Woman for unexplained reasons. Anyhow, years later, Wonder Woman is now a trained warrior, and a spy for the British Army during World War I, Steve Trevor, is shot down and crash lands on Themyscira, the island of the Amazons, along with a platoon of Germans who were pursuing him, due to having Dr. Poison's secret journal that explains the chemical weapons she's been cooking up for World War I. The Amazonians managed to fend off the invasion, but Wonder Woman finally sees the first-hand horrors of man that were described to her over the years by other Amazonians. After the conflict, Steve reveals to her that he has to go back to London and needs help returning, as he's a spy that works for the British Army during World War I, and he has incredibly sensitive information. Wonder Woman steals the God-Killer sword, her lasso, and her shield, and the pair head down to London. They were stopped by Diana's mom, but ultimately she allows them to go. Diana makes Steve promise to take her to the front, in hopes that she can stop Ares and bring peace to mankind. But Steve has to drop off the book about chemical weapons to Sir Patrick Morgan, who ends up helping them get to the front when he learns about Steve's plan to attempt to stop Dr. Poison once and for all on an unofficial mission. Diana and Steve assemble a team of Samir and Charlie, a couple of soldiers Steve worked with in the past, and head to the front where they meet a guide for hire, Chief, who takes them to the front. After seeing the horrors of the front, Diana chooses to act and rushes into the battlefield onto German lines, which allows the other British soldiers to advance, and from there they head to a village where they find Germans are holding an armistice gala that is set to be ambushed by a new chemical weapon created by Dr. Poison. Wonder Woman infiltrates the gala with the group and ends up assassinating Eric Lundoff, who she believes to be Ares, before learning Ares was actually Patrick Morgan, the direct supervisor to Steve in the British Army. Ares reveals that he guided the humans, but ultimately leaves the actual killing to the humans themselves, with only influencing them on the creation of weapons. He tells Wonder Woman to join him, so they can eradicate the humans and bring Earth back to an age of peace that the gods had before Zeus created man. He also reveals that they are half-siblings, with Zeus being both of their fathers. Diana rejects the idea of joining him, insisting that the power of love can overpower the power of hate humanity is also plagued with. And they get into a battle to the death, with Diana ultimately killing Ares. However, Steve dies, sacrificing himself to destroy Dr. Poison's new weapons. With the war now over, Diana returns to London feeling empty after the loss of her first love, Steve. Wonder Woman is a decent character, decently portrayed by Gal Gadot. She isn't some brilliant actress, but especially in this film she does a good job playing Wonder Woman, who's a fish out of water, despite being nearly 5,000 years old. She's still a bit out of her element in the real world, only knowing her home of Themyscira for thousands of years, where she's pretty much just honed her powers and trained to be an OP warrior, not encountering the ugliness of the impure human society until Steve arrives. She ignorantly believes the stories she's been passed down, that upon the death of Ares, who she is destined to meet in battle once he finds her, that all war will end for mankind. I'm not sure how Ares couldn't find her after 5,000 years. She lived on Themyscira the whole time, but whatever. There's some cute moments of her learning about what it means to be a human, with moments that feel fairly tragic for a woman who only knew peace on Paradise Island. I think the portrayal is alright, and although she's a bit of a blank state, she starts to grow her truer understanding of the real world by the end of the film, in an arc which I think is fairly well presented throughout the film. Steve Trevor is a bit goofy, played by Chris Pine, but obviously he has a good heart. Steve also comes to the realization throughout the film that the way wars are fought are a bit odd, with Wonder Woman's simplified views removing a lot of the political and strategical ways that wars are fought, claiming it makes no sense people like Patrick Morgan sit in boardrooms directing a war while soldiers and citizens are dying in the streets. It is pretty poignant towards the end when it turns out that Morgan is actually Ares, and Steve realizes perhaps the role he plays is just complacent to war in general, and perhaps he's complacent in not questioning war in general and the authority that creates those wars. His sacrifice at the end of the film is also slightly tragic, though I will admit I didn't feel much for the character for some reason by the time of his death. I think it more came down to Pine's performance, which wasn't bad, but I just didn't feel it when he died, even when the film set up a dramatic moment for Wonder Woman when the sounds of war are silenced and he professes his love for Diana and says he needs to sacrifice himself for the world to be safe. It's a noble end to the character, who's kind of a crux for the whole argument the film is making about war, but I just wish his death meant more to me. This isn't even a knock against the film, since I think on paper I should have felt more. I just think I didn't really care for some reason. Ares is probably the only other character I really need to talk about an arc for. Everyone else in this film are very minor, one-note characters. The other people in the Wonder Men, which is a team they assemble, don't really add much. Charlie being the only other member with a character arc, which is that he has PTSD and acts out, then freezes up in battle and regains his confidence when it counts. Anyhow, Ares is sort of a weak villain for multiple reasons, but most of the movie he's just kind of a boogeyman. For most of the movie, Wonder Woman wanted to kill him, in her head being that if she kills him, war against men will end. However, when she finally meets Ares in person, who turns out was secretly Patrick Morgan, who's occasionally in the background like a Scooby-Doo villain, is that humans are just going to kill each other no matter what, despite the minor intervention that Ares does. He then offers to have Wonder Woman join him, but I don't see why Wonder Woman would change his plan. He's a powerful god, but uses persuasion in his plans to get humanity to destroy itself. If Wonder Woman joined, how would that change? She doesn't have these persuasion powers. She's just a really powerful warrior who has enhanced strength and abilities. I don't really see what his master plan is here. Also, why risk his life and present himself to Wonder Woman when he could just keep working from the background and keep having humans destroy themselves? I guess it was to get Wonder Woman to join his cause. He was certainly doing more for his goal working behind the scenes, though. Also, the whole arc of the movie is about how man is bad and does it to itself, which is true in real life. Humans are pretty shitty, especially the ones with power, since they're willing to throw us peasants at other countries to be slaughtered like pigs for no good reason. I'm not saying there aren't justified reasons for war, but you're hard-pressed to find a war where there isn't some kind of imperialism or xenophobia at its core. So I think it's a good enough message. But then Ares is like, well, yeah, that's true, humans are bad, but I also control them and cause them to fight, but not really. In the end, the simple yet poignant idea of Ares' character gets so muddled it kind of ruins the whole point the movie was trying to make about Ares. The cinematography was handled by relatively obscure Matthew Jensen, whose biggest claim to fame before this film was Josh Trank's Chronicle and Fantastic Four films. I haven't seen Chronicle yet, but I will say, I thought Fantastic Four looked rough, and sadly, I don't think this film looks much better. They do a good job portraying the beautiful look of Themyscira, making it very picturesque and vibrant, almost like those old Windows screensavers or something. However, some of the set dressing was a little like Thor 2011, which is a bit ugly, and the gold tint plaguing some of the interiors are also in this film. However, the human world is very glum throughout, and they kind of overdo it, which makes this early 20th century London look cheap and weird. Even on the battlefield, this real ugly gray feel gets really boring. I think they could have done some beautiful imagery and contrasted it with war. Look at 2017 by Shawn Mendes, which came out a few years ago, and is quite beautiful throughout the movie, and it takes place during the height of World War I. Sometimes you'll be looking at beautiful backgrounds as an important character dies. I think blatantly making the world ugly overbears the message of the film, which is already a bit confused, and also starts to make it a bit of an eyesore to watch, especially since a lot of the film is shot on sound stages very obviously. I don't expect roses coming out of the concrete in the streets of London, but once we hit nature, perhaps the characters could travel and see a few beautiful landscapes and stuff. Think The Lord of the Rings. They're traveling throughout a really glum world that is under a huge war, and it still occasionally stops to look really beautiful and show what they're fighting for. Tonally, this movie is decent, like I said. The message is pretty overbearing, but the tone seems to always make sense and never takes me out of the film. I guess if I had a criticism, it would be Diana's optimism, occasionally downplaying the horrors we're seeing along with some of the superhero shenanigans, like when Diana destroys the clock tower, seeming a little strange to fit in this point of the film, which tries to balance some serious war tones with a, well, superhero blockbuster summer film. However, based on the concept, for the most part it works, even if fundamentally this isn't really what I wanted to see on screen. I think the similar Captain America the First Avenger made more sense being a war biopic, with that character understanding the gravity of the war better than Wonder Woman does. Plus, Steve Rogers felt a little more likely to be killed in such a war than Wonder Woman, who's just fucking invincible. For something like Wonder Woman, I wonder why they even said it during a war. I know superhero comics, especially during World War II, visited the war often, and it's an important aspect of superhero comics history, especially World War II, with them not really touching like Vietnam and stuff as much. But with that said, back in World War II, it was propaganda that was often pretty racist and intended to keep troops overseas motivated, and it helped the kids who were buying the books see their heroes helping our soldiers as a way of escapism. Then, the books would be recycled for war supplies, hence why 1940s comics are often very hard to come by. Try buying an early 1940s comic book. They're a lot rarer than they seem. However, by Korea and Vietnam, this takes a change, especially Vietnam, which would seem as more of a pointless war, at least where it had less nuance to who the true good guys were, so comics have since avoided the topic for the most part. Not to say there aren't characters like Captain America who've touched on it since. His background is so cooked into war and stuff that it really wouldn't make sense for him to avoid it. But superheroes are an escapist genre, and I just don't really understand why they needed to set this Wonder Woman movie during a war, when I think the tone was so confused that it doesn't really add much. And while this movie had a solid message, I think the film fails to land on its feet when it comes to the message in a lot of regards. We already talked about Wonder Woman in my Batman v Superman segment, so let's talk about the supporting cast and where they were adapted from. Steve Trevor first appeared alongside Wonder Woman in her first appearance, All-Star Comics number 8, where he loses control of his plane during a spy mission in World War II and meets Wonder Woman on Themyscira, ultimately brings her to modern civilization where he convinces Wonder Woman to help mankind. This isn't much different than the version we see in the film, except swap out the Second World War for the First World War, and boom, there you go. Steve is Diana's primary love interest and essentially her Lois Lane. I would say the primary difference between the two characters being that Chris Pine's version is slightly more proactive and less of a goofball than the original version. Ares was first adapted into DC Comics in Wonder Woman number 1 in 1940 as the grandfather of Wonder Woman. At the time, he was known as Mars, which is the Roman god of war. He later became Ares, named after the Greek god of war. Regardless, the version we see in the film is most notably based on George Perez's take. Though it is worth noting, the filmmakers makes him a little more of a symbolic evil, with him more indirectly influences humans to take up weapons until his final battle with Wonder Woman. Hippolyta is Wonder Woman's mother, who originally created Wonder Woman from clay in her original appearances before making her after a sweet lovemaking session with Ares. In the comic and the film, she first disapproves of Wonder Woman helping humans until Wonder Woman proves her worth and whatever. Dr. Poison was a Wonder Woman antagonist created for Sensation Comics number 2, who was kind of a racist stereotype of a Japanese person in the comics where she made reverso gas to make soldiers do the opposite of what they're told. In the film, she creates mustard gas to horribly kill humans. The modern interpretation is also just like a woman who works in Germany rather than a Japanese princess. The comics were a little weird and very racist in the 1940s, that's for sure. Etta Candy was Wonder Woman's stumpy sidekick introduced in Sensation Comics number 2. She was a recurring comic relief character that often accompanied Wonder Woman on missions. The movie was a little less cruel to the character, making her more proactive in working with Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor. She's also updated to Steve's secretary and confidant, from her original origin of just being some weirdo kid in college that followed Wonder Woman around. Artemis doesn't do much but die at the hand of Ares and make a brief cameo fighting Darkseid in Justice League, which we'll come back to. But she first appeared in Wonder Woman Volume 2 number 90, and at one point acted as Wonder Woman before leaving the role later on. Wonder Woman actually pulled a lot of deep-cut characters into the DCEU and updated them with some reverence for the source material, which didn't seem super common for the DCEU at the time. The score for this film is bizarre. It feels like a mix of Transformers, Star Wars, and Harry Potter, but never really picking an angle in which to tackle it. Rupert Gregg Williams composed it, and he's done a lot of things, but nothing super notable. He did a lot of work for Adam Sandler's production company, Happy Madison, and would work on both Wonder Woman and Aquaman for the DCEU. It's definitely a solid score for someone who doesn't do much larger budget scores, and especially coming from working on mid-budget comedies and stuff, but it's not as memorable and iconic as some of the industry's biggest names can pull off. The Wonder Woman theme also plays a good few times, and yep, I still hate this theme deeply. I didn't like it during Batman vs Superman, and this movie hasn't changed my mind. The weird electric guitar thing doesn't work. It is especially out of place in this film, which is supposed to be a war epic, when a guitar with tons of reverb plays a shitty little riff a few times that sounds straight out of an asset pack you'd get for a few bucks on any music sampling film score pack. It's just cheap sounding, and I feel like WB to this day tried to make this riff a thing, but Wonder Woman deserves a better score. This is lame, especially considering both Superman and Batman have not one, but multiple iconic scores throughout their film history. Alright, whatever, maybe next time. Maybe the DCU can figure this out for Wonder Woman. She needs something more iconic. This film was edited by Martin Walsh, who is a veteran editor at this point, starting in the 1980s and continuing work to this day. While he isn't a huge name in Hollywood, he edited films like V for Vendetta and the Clash of the Titans remake. He's definitely a good working man's director, nothing too flashy with Wonder Woman, but he did a good job making the film work. I also think, even despite my mixed reaction to the story of this film, Patty Jenkins was doing a pretty competent job bringing the film to screen. And the stuff she was shooting gave the editor plenty of footage to work with to assemble a very coherent film. Wonder Woman skips out on doing an end credit scene, although it does have a short film, which I'll talk about in my short film section coming up later if you're watching the full video. And if you're just watching the Wonder Woman segment, not the larger DCEU video as a whole, I wish I could tell you, you were missing out on a lot not hearing me talk about the Etta Candy short film that was definitely retrofitted from an end credit scene. Still, watch the full retrospective. I have many sleepless nights wondering if it was worth it all, and you can learn about what Etta Candy was doing after this movie. That's not out yet, by the way. It's coming. I gotta finish the whole project before that happens, so stay tuned. Stay tuned and come back. Rewatch it. This is typically the part where I discuss my positives and negatives on the film that don't fit into the basic fundamentals of the story, and I do have a couple of notes on both, but there's less to really say about this film in general on these fronts, because frankly, a lot of Wonder Woman's positives and negatives are baked directly into the movie itself, so I already discussed a lot of my major thoughts, but I do have a few notes. This movie, for some reason, sneaks in some sexy innuendos, as the kids say. For one, we see an ass-naked and objectified Steve Trevor.
Would you say you're a typical example of your sex?
Now, while you could make an argument a superhero film wouldn't get away with this for a female character, which is probably true, I would argue women are objectified all the time in films. I mean, if you're not watching slasher films in part to see some titties, I don't know why you're watching them. If the film has a budget of under $10 million, the film either expects females to show some titties, or it's a Lifetime movie. With that said, I think we should have seen some Steve Trevor dong. And I say that as a proud straight man. The reason being is this one's for the ladies. They should be able to see some dong the same way I watch Hollywood chainsaw hookers to enjoy some titties. That's right, ladies, I got your back on this one. Anyways, there's also a point that got me in my deepest insecurities. At one point, Wonder Woman reveals that a philosopher wrote a 12-volume series that determines that women don't need men for anything but procreation, and that only men are getting their rocks off, so to speak. This could be true, but remember, if you hear the buzzing, boys, you did a good job. Don't worry about it, just roll over and go to sleep. Anyhow, 12 volumes? I mean, she didn't elaborate on the page count, but that is an impressive amount of volumes on the topic. The movie is a fish out of water tale about a woman discovering the world, which she was ignorant about. It ties into the themes pretty well and leads to some cute and fun moments with Wonder Woman learning about human culture and the good and the bad of it. It is to the superhero genre what Jon Favreau's Elf is to the Christmas genre. Fish out of water films always get me a bit, and I'll be honest, it can make it pretty easy to ignore some leaps in logic that may come up, and you can easily chalk them down to the innocence of the character. That said, I think even with that handicap, I still had yet to see a really solid fish out of water film, with my favorite probably being Paddington. But that film is also kind of just a cute film about acceptance and protecting the innocent bears at all costs. So, fish out of water films, I mean, they kind of get handicapped. It's hard to make a great fish out of water film, but at the same time, it's also kind of hard to make a bad one. So, yeah, do with that information what you will. Okay, I didn't have much positives to add in my review that I didn't elaborate on with the fundamentals, and sadly I have more issues with this film to talk about. The effects in this film are mostly poor and not really up to par with the other films. In fairness, this may be in part due to Hollywood's clear bias against women and minorities. They see it as a riskier endeavor to put money into those films. That's not me trying to be woke either. I'm saying the effects in both this film and Black Panther are visually much worse than that of their contemporaries around this time. I mean, 2017 to like 2020 was the peak of the superhero genre. You know, the checkbooks were open. And this movie and Black Panther are two that notably have really shitty effects for the time and turned out to be good gambles. These are problems their sequels, interestingly, wouldn't really have after both Wonder Woman and Black Panther turned out to be critical and commercial successes. But in the case of this film, we can also partially blame Patty Jenkins for the movie looking bad, because she did a lot of nauseating slow-mo and wrote the entire movie to be gloomy, ugly, or super vibrant and bright. Meaning pretty much every shot in this film is shot on a digital set rather than finding actual locations a la 1970 or The Lord of the Rings. And the fakeness really shows. Also, if you're gonna do this whole ass movie in CG sets, why not just pick more interesting places for this climax than a CGI tarmac? Fast and Furious 6, which interestingly also had Gal Gadot, has a much more badass runway scene, since they're jumping between cars and blowing shit up and shit like that. And yeah, that climax goes on for like 20 minutes, so you don't know how they're still driving down this tarmac. And you're bound to wonder, how the fucking hell is this runway so big? But who cares, man? That shit's fun. And this movie, that also takes place on a tarmac, they just stand 40 feet apart and shoot boring CGI lasers at each other, and it's lame as hell. The film kind of has the same vibe as those Fantastic Beast films, in the worst way possible, with the dark, CGI-ridden streets. I mean, I definitely find this movie less boring and contrived than those movies, but not really by much, and the fact that this movie was bringing to mind those terrible Fantastic Beasts movies is not in any way good. You don't want that to happen. It just has that look and tone to where I actually start to wonder why Warner Brothers likes this type of style, because I don't think it truly works out well in the end of Wonder Woman, the movie. It shifts to reveal that love unites all humans, as much as war does, with even the German survivors celebrating upon the death of Ares. Like, what did these Germans really learn? I think it'd be more powerful at the end of the film if it was a little more bittersweet, which they kind of try when she looks at a picture of Steve Trevor. Perhaps it's fresh in my mind, but I just watched The Holdovers by Alexander Payne at the time of writing this. At the time of recording this, it's been a while, but regardless. And the film is a series of tragedies that happen to the characters, and things never pan out the way the characters hope, but that's kind of life. And the characters found some good moments and learned to accept the good with the bad, because that's just life. I think in the ending of Wonder Woman, there should have been some similar realization. She sees humanity at its worst, and killing Ares really achieves nothing, and Steve's dead, but she understands the underlying good in humanity, or at least the understanding that most of humanity just wants things to work out, and that there's some bad apples out there, or perhaps something more nuanced than that, and she dedicates her life to bettering that, and amplifying the positive, and defending it from the negative forces. I think seeing the Germans and the Americans celebrating after the death of Ares is really cheesy. The more nuanced ending is the one I wanted, for sure, and this Power of Love stuff is blatantly announcing that it's a cheesy way to wrap up the film, and makes the ending little more than black and white. I just wish there was more nuance to it. Like if the movie actually made you put a little thought to get to what the moral's trying to tell you, that'd be more satisfying. If you actually had to think about something and come to a conclusion. I guess what can I expect from superhero cinema? Even the best isn't known for its subtlety, but it's a thought. The film also has a Native American man named Chief, whose character makes no sense to me. He's your stereotypical war guide Native American who stays out of the conflict and instead guides people to the war for money.
Nowhere better to be than in a war where you don't take a side.
I want to live. You can live, but do you want to keep the rock and pee on it?
But then changes his mind without any real arc or even anybody bringing attention to it, and he just joins Wonder Woman on her quest. I have several questions. For one, why is a Native American man alone on the German front in World War I? That doesn't really seem like his fight, but if it was, how and why would he? There were like 11,000 Native Americans that fought in the war, many of whom were drafted and didn't actually elect to go there, but Chief was on the British front for some reason, not the American front. That is a small nitpick. Regardless, his character is cool, but then Wonder Woman dramatically storms onto no man's land, and he follows. This is a bit odd because he plays a neutral party throughout the film who's there for money, kind of a bounty hunter type, like Han Solo.
I bet you have.
McClunky.
But unlike Han Solo, it doesn't really explain why he wants to fight in the war, he just suddenly does. He has no skin in the game for either the British or the German forces, so why the change of heart? I don't know. It's never explained. I think it would have made more sense and added more nuance if she waved for Chief to follow or something. He had a moment where he shook his head and walked off. That way we can see that some men are just in it for greed, and that also adds more to what the film is trying to comment on about humanity and its willingness to do bad things, or at least be complacent for personal gain. You know, the theme of the movie? What I'm trying to illustrate with all these examples is that the film claims it's trying to say something but rarely backs it up with evidence beyond Wonder Woman blatantly saying aloud what the film is trying to tell us. The movie really wants to tell us its morals without actually showing the moral on screen, and that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is weak storytelling. Watching this movie is difficult. I feel like anytime I watch it, I dislike it a little more. This was my third or fourth viewing of the film, and I really didn't care for it this time. Like, it's not terrible, but it's terribly overrated, that's for sure. The arcs that are here had effort put into them conceptually, but failed to land due to a lack of subtlety, and more of a tell not show mentality. The acting is okay, but nothing stands out as particularly exceptional. The editing is good, and the music is pretty generic. Where the movie really stumbles is with all of the CGI and slow motion that makes this movie sort of boring and fake looking, on top of not really showing anything interesting to look at. I think despite having a lot of negative things to say, that the film comes together and hobbles together something pretty coherent and solid. I still think it's wildly overrated, but you can feel that genuine effort was put into the film, and the people involved believed in the project and the story they were telling, even though, again, I don't think it wholly panned out. I also think it keeps true to the heart of the comic book characters for the first time in the DCEU to this point, which I think is important to any reinvention of a comic book character, and that it's something that is pretty commendable. I feel like people involved in this delved into the lore to find a lot of characters that may not have gotten much love otherwise, like Etta Candy, for example, and, in Etta's case, added a little dignity to the character while maintaining her humor aside from her comic book appearances from 80 years ago. I mean, originally, she was a punchline, but here, they made her funny but also a dignified character who's an active part of the team. Overall, I think I like this movie less than my first viewing for sure, but giving my first very detailed watch and seeing it in theaters is bound to make that happen, especially when there's a lot of kind of messy stuff in this movie. Wonder Woman made $822 million off a budget of approximately $150 million, which means it made over $500 million after marketing, which is a really great box office haul. It also did very well critically, with a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 76 out of 100 on Metacritic, which is really solid, with critics calling it a good marriage of the iconic DC filmmakers Richard Donner and Christopher Nolan. People said the pacing and tone were solid, and even with some messy aspects like the overall reliance on exposition, the film still came together well. The setting was also praised as being pretty well done for a superhero film, and the movie won several smaller awards during award series. Nothing too notable, but Gal Gadot, Patty Jenkins, and the stunt team primarily won some trophies. So, that was Wonder Woman.